In this video lecture, we're going to look at the concept of private government as argued by Elizabeth Anderson. And the idea is going to be that private businesses are actually like a form of private government. And I think the main audience that Anderson is trying to convince here are those that have liberal values, right, that say, well, a government should be democratic, it should have liberal rights, and that things like freedom, right, are a value to be promoted. And yet, what Anderson is going to show, though, is that there's this whole other sphere, which actually people spend most of their waking lives at, which is the sphere of employment. And she's going to show the ways in which working under a business is like existing under a private government. And under a private government, which is like a dictatorship. So what I want to do is actually begin by reading the beginning of this. I think rhetorically it's very powerful. So Anderson begins by writing, "Imagine a government that assigns almost everyone a superior whom they must obey. Although superiors give most inferiors a routine to follow, there is no rule of law. Orders may be arbitrary and can change at any time without prior notice or opportunity to appeal. They are neither elected nor removable by their inferiors. Inferiors have no right to complain in court about how they are being treated, except in a few narrowly defined cases. They also have no right to be consulted about the order they are given. There are multiple ranks in the society ruled by this government. The content of the orders people receive varies depending on their rank. Higher ranked individuals may be granted considerable freedom in deciding how to carry out their orders and may issue some orders to some inferiors. The most highly ranked individual takes no orders but issues many. The lowest rank may have their bodily movements and speech minutely regulated for most of the day. This government does not recognize a personal or private sphere of autonomy free from sanction. It may prescribe a dress code and forbid certain hairstyles. Everyone lives under surveillance to ensure that they are complying with orders. Superiors may snoop into inferiors' mail and record their phone conversations. Suspicionless searches of their bodies and personal effects may be routine. They can be ordered to submit to medical testing. The government may dictate the language spoken and forbid communication in any other language. It may forbid certain topics of discussion. People can be sanctioned for their consensual sexual activity or for their choice of spouse or life partner. They can be sanctioned for their political activity and required to engage in political activity they do not agree with. The economic system of the society run by this government is communist. The government owns all the non-labor means of production in the society it governs. It organizes production by means of central planning. The form of the government is a dictatorship. In some cases, the dictator is appointed by an oligarchy. In other cases, the dictator is self-appointed. Although the control that this government exercises over its members is pervasive, its sanctioning powers are limited. It cannot execute or imprison anyone for violating orders. It can demote people to lower ranks. The most common sanction is exile. Individuals are also free to immigrate, although if they do, there's usually no going back. Exile or immigration can have severe collateral consequences. The vast majority have no option but to try to immigrate to another communist dictatorship, although there are many to choose from. A few manage to escape into anarchic hinterlands or set up their own dictatorships. This government mostly secures compliance with carrots. Because it controls all the income of society, it pays more to people who follow orders particularly well and promotes them to higher rank. Because it controls communication, it also has a propaganda apparatus that often persuades many to support the regime. This need not amount to brainwashing. In many cases, people willingly support the regime and comply with its orders because they identify with and profit from it. Others support the regime because although they are subordinate to some superior, they get to exercise dominion over inferiors. It should not be surprising that support for the regime of these reasons tends to increase the more highly ranked a person is. So the question is, would people subject to such a government be free? So the basic idea is that private business is a dictatorship. Now, Anderson refers to it as being a communist dictatorship. I think Anderson does this because rhetorically it's very powerful. And it's very powerful to those who are opposed to communism and they want to embrace liberal democratic values. And so this idea that a government, right, does not allow competition, owns all the capital, and is a dictatorship, it's meant to look like the Soviet Union, for example. Although, of course, this is a little bit problematic because communism is not meant to be a dictatorship in these ways. Now, some attempts at it undoubtedly have ended in a kind of dictatorship like in the Soviet Union, but that's not always the case. And in many ways, it wouldn't be accurate to describe such a setup of government as communist. There's no democracy, for example, and the point of communism is that there's democratic collectivity with regard to person's relation to capital. And we'll see a little bit of that a bit later, though. The idea, though, is that, right, so if private business is a dictatorship, then the dictator of this, private business is the CEO. Or, we could just say the owner, the capitalist, whatever, right? Now, punishment, of course, is not being jailed, but you are fired, right? In this way, you're exiled. You're kicked out from that community. The government, so this private establishment, owns all the assets, right? So, of course, you as a worker, you don't own anything that you're dealing with. It's all owned by the CEO or the owner, right? And there are no internal markets for competition. It's, in a way, central planning. It's all determined by, ultimately, right, the owner. As Anderson says, indeed, the boundary of the firm is defined as the point at which markets end and authoritarian centralized planning and direction begin. So there's going to be two arguments here. The first is that most workers are governed by dictatorships in their work lives whose authority extends beyond the realm of the business itself. That what's also striking is not only that within the sphere of the business, right, when let's say you're a wage worker and you clock in, that the business has authority over what you do while you're working, but also that authority extends beyond when you clock out as well. Now the task, and this is going to be the second argument then, is that what needs to happen is there needs to be a creation of different instruments that are able to discern the normatively relevant features of our current institutions of workplace government. So ways in which we can transform this to represent more of like a liberal democratic government in business as well, right? So we don't have any kind of authoritarianism in any part of our lives. Now first, the very idea of private government. It seems like this is a contradiction, right? On the one hand, government is public, and yet we're calling it something private, which seem to be, mutually exclusive. Right? So when we talk about the public is understood to be some kind of a sphere in which persons live, and they collectively make decisions which actually have effects on other people, right? So there are obligations typically enforced by law, right? And usually those decisions that are made, right? The reason why they can be enforced is because within the public sphere you have first a state. So a state is the authority over first a domain, and second, it has the power to enforce then their authority over the said domain. Now, a government is just a way in which a state organizes itself. So it's the ways in which an organizational entity has a certain kind of an authority, what are the procedures, and how it issues orders to others, and because it has, government being a state, the authority that is issued by that entity is backed by sanctions in one or more areas of life within the public sphere. Now, the private sphere is understood to be that where public interest ends. Right? So we talk about, typically, the public sphere is that place where we talk about, hey, if we want to have markets, right, or we want to have a military to defend our community, right? Now, this involves obligations from each other. Maybe it involves conscription. Maybe it says, hey, you can't, like, sell people in the marketplace. But this idea of the private is where no one then can tell you, like, for example, when you enter your own home, what you can and cannot do, right? The government no longer has any interest in that, so long as, typically it's understood you're not interfering with the interests of other people as well in a way that they haven't consented to. Now, the reason why this is not a contradiction, though, private government, is because one is subject to private government wherever, one is subordinate to authorities who can order you around and sanction you for not complying over some domain of your life, and two, the authorities treat it as none of your business across a wide range of cases what orders it issues or why it sanctions you. Now, in this way, of course, if they, we'll look at the first example, okay? The fact that an entity can sanction you for not complying with some orders over some domain of your life means, in a way, within that domain, it is a state. It has a certain area with which it says it has authority over, and it has certain ways in which it can sanction people to respect that. Now, secondly, this is why it's a private government, because as opposed to a public government, whereby the authority it issues is up to public deliberation, in this case, it's not up to any deliberation. It is solely up to one individual, the owner. And in this way, therefore, right, it's private, because all the interests of the people who are being sanctioned, they actually don't have any involvement in the sanctions that are being made. So in this way, it actually doesn't interest them, even if it affects them. So this is what we can understand to be a private government then, right? In the one way, it functions de facto as a government, a public government, and yet it fails to have that crucial aspect of the public sphere whereby those issues that occur in the public sphere are the issues of all people that are affected by it. Whereas this is not the case in a private institution. Furthermore, we can also understand this concept of private government by looking at the ways in which liberty might be restricted, and then, of course, ultimately the ways in which liberty can be promoted within a business establishment. So there are three concepts of liberty. The first is negative liberty. Negative liberty is basically the idea that one should not be interfered with by the actions of other without one's consent, right? So I should be free to go to the store and buy what I want without someone coming and stealing my car or holding me at gunpoint for me to hand over my money, right? I should be free from then external coercion. The second concept of liberty is positive liberty. The idea here is not, now it might include negative liberty. You might want to have this as well, of course. But it's one thing to say that no one is going to stop you, for example, from purchasing a house. But it's another thing if you actually don't have the ability to purchase a house. In this way, you lack the positive aspect of liberty because you don't have a rich menu of options that are effectively accessible to you, given your resources. So one, for example, might have then negative liberty in that no one is stopping them from buying a house, but if they don't actually have the ability to own a home, then they are denied that aspect of liberty. Finally, the concept of Republican liberty. Now, this involves the will. So if we talk about negative liberty as not being coerced in our actions by others, and positive liberty as being able to effectively carry out a desire, Republican liberty concerns the desires that are created. So the idea of Republican liberty is that no one is dominating you in terms of your will, that you are subject to no one's arbitrary, unaccountable will, that you are able for yourself to determine your own desires. And then hopefully, right, no one is physically stopping you, so you have negative liberty, and hopefully you have the actual capacity then to carry out and exercise that will that you have yourself developed. Now, within the context of private government then, we can see that one's liberty can be constrained by private governors in domains of activity that are kept private from the state in ways that can overall benefit or hurt people's liberty, just as with, for example, a state. And we can think of all these ways in which, for example, perhaps what job I want to perform or what tasks I want to do, that's not up to my own will, right? That is determined by someone else. So the actual ability to determine my own will of what I want to do within my capacity as a laborer, that's determined by the boss or ultimately the owner. Now, what actually I have that I can effectively carry out, that also is up to the owner. That takes capital. If I work for someone else, then the ability to use capital to carry out the certain wills, that again is up to someone else. And finally, of course, one does not have negative liberty entirely in certain cases, right? I mean, if we look at a government might say that, hey, a boss can't whip you, but a boss can do other things that involves negative liberty. I mean, sometimes, right, they can lock doors and keep you from leaving until your break is over or until your working hours are over, right? Think about stories in history of factories burning down where the bosses locked the doors such that people couldn't leave. A fire broke out and people died. Right? I believe this was the I want to say the shirtwaist factory fire, although I think I'm getting that name wrong. That's a very historical example of this. Now, why is it then that employees, right, workers, are so pervasively subject to private government? So we see then what the concept of private government is, but why does it exist? Well, the first reason is that the Industrial Revolution moved the primary site of paid work from the household to the factory. Right? So it used to be the case prior to the Industrial Revolution that most people, of course, would subsist around their home on some land, or they would do work within their own home. Now, Anderson says that this had the potential to be liberatory because it meant now people, right, can, whatever desires they might have more access in a positive way, right, with the sense of positive liberty, to pursue, to actually carry out those other desires they might have to live a more sufficient and a more flourishing life. But why wasn't this carried out? Why wasn't this made liberatory? And instead turned actually the site of work in the factory into a kind of dictatorship. The first reason is that technological changes that drove the Industrial Revolution involved huge concentrations of capital. Right? So this meant that one needed, of course, to pursue their own desires, to have a huge concentration of capital. Well, the problem is that a minority of people had this huge concentration of capital. So what is going to be done with it and what this enables is up to a minority of people. Secondly, the open-ended authority of managers enabled better efficient use of capital at the direction of the owner. Right? This meant that, well, authority is going to be put in the hands of a limited few to carry out, right, this goes back to the idea of central planning, to carry out the rationale that is determined by the owner of that capital. So in these ways then, right, the freedom of what workers had to do to better themselves was limited to what was framed or determined by the owners of this capital. Now, this isn't a sufficient explanation, though, as to why employees now are so pervasively subject to private government, because this also doesn't actually say why normatively, people ought then to be subject to private government. So, one further reason someone might say is, well, look, people ought not to be subject to, private government, but the reality is that people agree to a contract, so they consent to such behavior, right? So, Nozick, for example, might say, look, it is possible for someone to sell themselves into slavery as long as they agree to be enslaved. But here's the problem that Anderson points out. A meeting of the minds of contractual parties does not actually occur. I mean, for one, not all of the aspects that might be involved in being an employer, and the scope of power that the of the employee, and not the full scope of power that the employer has, are typically the employee is fully aware of when they sign the contract. But secondly, we also have the problem that your options are actually pretty limited. I mean, if I am out of work and I need to support a family, I'm going to be willing to choose, certain jobs, right, that might give more authority to the boss over myself. And in this way, I'm certainly going to be denied my Republican freedom because I'm not able to fully use my free, independent will to form the desires that I want to pursue, right? In this way, basic problems of subsistence are overriding that. Now, it is the case, right, that the state determines the scope and limits of employers' authority through a complex system of laws. In some cases, this is for the benefit of workers, but through the most of history of capitalism, this has not been the case. I mean, there have been some gains, right? But we still have it the case that, employment at will laws exist, right? These are typically known as right to work laws. And this ends up ceding effectively all rights from the employee to the employer, right? Except, of course, those that are guaranteed them by the law of the government. But even then, oftentimes, employers end up using their power to kind of still, do things illegally. Now, additionally, it's not correct, as someone might object to this, to say that, well, authority can't exist where individuals are free to exit because, right, any worker is free to leave one job site that they don't like and go work for some other employer, right? So someone might say, well, therefore they're not being coerced, right? This authority doesn't exist there because they're free to exit. Anderson says this is like saying Italians could immigrate from Italy while Mussolini was in power. Therefore, there was no, dictatorship in Italy because, again, people were free to leave that dictatorship. That's just simply not the way in which dictatorship works. That just because people can leave doesn't mean that there's not a dictatorship. Now, why didn't libertarian movements enable workplace freedom? Well, the first reason that Anderson gives is, Thomas Paine and other liberals focused mainly on critiques of the state. So where their critiques were effective in limiting the power and the ways in which the state can abuse its authority over citizens, they neglected the ways in which private business can use authority over workers. Secondly, the early Republican Party focused on the interests of business people when they were thinking about market freedom. So where, yes, they were concerned with freedom in the marketplace and promoting freedom in the marketplace, the problem is they primarily thought of market freedom from the perspective of the owner of capital, the employer, and they did not think about what it might mean for the worker to be free. Thirdly, 19th century laissez-faire liberals focused on the entry and exit conditions of the labor contract, leaving the rest of the domain of work to be privatized, right? So, of course, it is the case that prior to capitalism, when feudalism existed, a serf was bound to the land, right? They could not leave. Now, in capitalism, it was the case that at least in theory, workers can freely agree to work for some owner and then leave that contract, with that owner and work for a different owner. Now, it was the case, though, that this was often abused, and there were all sorts of ways in which owners would seek to basically, in effect, enslave their employees to work for them, such that they might, make it very difficult for them to move, might make them very difficult to just quit their job, might do all sorts of things, which, think about like company towns, for example, right? The company town is basically a village that's set up by the business that supplies all the resources for people to leave. Well, how are you going to be able to leave if all the resources in that town are determined by the business, right? It's very, very difficult. So, on the one hand, it made sense, of course, for laissez-faire liberals to focus on just the basics of freedom for entry and exit and conditions of the labor contract. But the problem is that freedom of entry and exit from any employment relation is not sufficient to justify the outcome of dictatorship in the workplace, right? So the reason Anderson gives is consent to an option within a certain set cannot justify the option set itself. So if I give you a bunch of bad options and you pick one of those bad options and I say, see, look, you freely chose one of those bad options, but all you were given were bad options, that doesn't mean it justifies the person consenting to one of the many bad options if that's all there were bad options. Anderson says, that is like telling the citizens of the communist bloc of Eastern Europe that their freedom could be secured by a right to immigrate to any country as long as they stayed behind the Iron Curtain. Right? The reason is, well, you leave one business, okay, you go work at another business, but the power within the business in each one remains the same. Right? The owner has full authority over you. Finally, most workers' movements in the 19th century focused on the length of the working day or wages, not on power. Now again, this was very important. I mean, at one point in time, workers were working 6 days a week, 16 hours a day. Right? 16 hours a day. You don't have enough time to eat, to take care of family. You get 1 day off a week. That's not enough time to recover. So it makes sense why, again, right, socialist and labor movements would focus on reducing the length of the working day. But it still said, hey, okay, we'll work less, but you can still have all the power over us, like a dictatorship, right? That doesn't justify the power itself. So Anderson says, if the Industrial Revolution meant they could not be their own bosses at work, at least they could try to limit the length of the working day so that they would have some hours during which they could choose for themselves rather than follow someone else's orders. So what Anderson does is provide 4 different general strategies that attempt to advance and protect the liberties of the governed under any type of government. So both under public government and private government. So these are the same kinds of rights that citizens should have in a liberal democracy as workers should have in a business. Now the first one is exit. So there should be a strong legal presumption against such barriers to exit to protect workers' freedom to exit their employer's government. In the same way, a citizen should be free to leave, living under a certain government and go live somewhere else. In the same way, an employee should be able to leave working for one owner and work for another owner. Now, this might entail, because we might say, well, okay, formally this is guaranteed. But it might also be the case that we want to say, well, it should be, someone should have the freedom to, not only get unemployment when they are fired from a job, but also get unemployment if they choose to freely leave a job in search of a better job, right? Because a lot of times, I mean, think about the fact that a lot of workers' health care is tied to their employer. Well, that's going to, rationally prevent them from leaving that job for the sake of a better job, because do you want to take that risk of not having health care? What if you have to provide for your whole family? Do you want to take that risk that, something serious happens when you don't have health insurance while you're searching for a better job? So maybe there should be some kinds of positive protections, right? So this would enable positive liberty for people to freely choose under what conditions and for whom they want to work. Now, the second one is the rule of law. So, Anderson says, first, authority may be exercised only through laws duly passed and publicized in advance, rather than arbitrary orders issued without any process. Secondly, subjects are at liberty to do anything not specifically prohibited by law. Thirdly, laws are generally applicable to everyone in similar circumstances. And fourthly, subjects have rights of due process before suffering any sanctions for noncompliance. So in the same way that we wouldn't want arbitrary laws or laws which can just be, determined by any cop or judge or whatever, right, to be imposed on any one citizen, it should be the same thing for workers, that workers know what is expected of them, they know what they shouldn't be doing, and it can't be the case that randomly some boss can tell a worker, oh, you have to do this, or you can't do that, or I'm going to punish you because you did such and such, when it wasn't made aware, right? There has to be some kind of consistency and some kind of universality in the ways in which orders are implemented in private business, for all the same reasons we would want a universal and rational law in the case of government, right? We don't want a law that only says Austin can't park, downtown on the weekends or something like that, right? That would be arbitrary. The third one, substantive constitutional rights. So Anderson says, a just workplace constitution should incorporate basic constitutional rights akin to a Bill of Rights against employers. It was only in 1998 that OSHA issued a regulation requiring employers to recognize workers' right to use a bathroom. Now, again, right, we want a Bill of Rights that limit what a government can do against citizens. So, right, freedom of speech, right to not just randomly have their property seized, and so on. In the same way, we want constitutional rights for workers. I mean, even if OSHA issued a regulation that requires employers to recognize workers' right to use a bathroom, we still know that this is not the case. I mean, there's been a lot of a publication about, for example, in Amazon, workers not having sufficient amount of time to use the restroom when they need to, so they end up having to pee in bottles and leaving these bottles all around the factory, right? I mean, this seems like a basic right that someone should have. When they need to go to the bathroom, they can go to the bathroom. Or, like, I have a friend, for example, in their office, they were told they cannot make coffee while they are working. It is only if they are on their lunch break or prior to clocking in. Any other time, they cannot get up to make a cup of coffee. That seems pretty arbitrary, and it seems like someone should have a right, if they're thirsty, right, to get water, to get a cup of coffee, or something else like that. So it shouldn't be the case that a boss can determine all these ways in which, I mean, it really seems like a boss basically is saying to the worker, you can't turn your head left until 12 o'clock when you go on your lunch break, That seems pretty excessive. Finally, there should be voice. So Anderson says, there is no adequate substitute for recognizing workers' voice in their government. Voice can more readily adapt workplace rules to local conditions than state regulations can, while incorporating respect for workers' freedom, interests, and dignity. Just because workplace governance requires hierarchy of offices does not mean that higher office holders must be unaccountable to the governed, or that the governed should not play any role in managerial decision-making. So for the same reasons that we say a public government should be set up by the citizens, so the citizens should have the right to vote, to have a say over what the government is doing, to recall politicians that they think are corrupt or not carrying out their general will, the same thing should exist in the workplace, since workers are subject to the kind of similar authority that citizens are subject to by a public government. Now, there are three general ways that this can take place. First is worker representation on corporate boards. Now, this is actually a law in Germany, that on corporate boards there has to be roughly about 50% or just below 50% worker representation on those corporate boards. Secondly, labor unions. Labor unions are a bit more powerful, and they enable collective bargaining rights. Finally, workers' self-directed enterprises. These are where workers democratically and collectively determine how the business operates. So one, with the workers' self-directed enterprise, they cut out the middleman, which is basically what a labor union is. So a labor union is good because it means that workers can, collectively band together to say, hey, these are our demands, and we're going to stop working so you can't make profit if you don't meet these demands, right? And this, has a back and forth, eventually until an agreement is struck, right? But with the worker self-directed enterprise, what this means is that you don't have to negotiate with the boss because all the workers are their own boss, right? They collectively own and run the enterprise through a democratic process. So these are the four different strategies, again, for advancing and protecting liberties of the governed under any type of government, including private businesses.